In Manila, the Philippines capital, there's a curious concrete block that starkly contrasts with the city's skyline. It has a very characteristic shape of a World War II battleship, and its name is Fort Drum. It protected the South Bay of Manila for a long time. At first glance, it seems to be a very old warship hull that was damaged and abandoned. But as I mentioned, in fact, its hull is made of concrete. And although at first glance it seems that it once sailed, this concrete ship is actually stationary. This huge military complex is now completely in ruins. Its construction was completed at the beginning of the 20th century, so it was present in the most impressive battles in human history. Even before the two world wars, it had a fateful end in 1945 in the Second World War, while it was facing the Japanese Empire. But because the United States of America built a concrete ship in the Philippines even before the First World War began, why create a defensive enclave of these characteristics in the middle of the sea? What was the purpose of this incredible and historic military complex? Well, as always in these videos, we will answer all these questions, and very likely this video will leave you absorbed. Ford started on a small island known as the Friar, which with the set of surrounding islands in the area such as Corregidor and Horse, all form a natural barrier at the entrance of Manila Bay. These were fundamental for Spain. When the Philippines was its colony, these small islands served to monitor the entrance of hostile ships and as a toll to ensure the safety of the ships that were taking out and introducing resources from the Philippines. The Friar had its peak of activity in the Spanish-American War in 1898, where the Spaniards often surprised the American fleet from these small islands, but mainly from Corregidor and the Friar. It was very difficult to pass ships through the bay without being seen from any of these islands, even with bad weather. Or worse, these ships were often attacked from the same. Either way, after the famous Battle of Manila Bay, where the United States defeated Spain in an epic naval combat, the United States took control of the Philippines, but the Americans feared that the Spaniards would attack the island again, so they decided to fortify the bay even more. This had a length of approximately 12 kilometers, and there were fortifications on Corregidor and on Horse Island, so the Americans came up with the idea of also fortifying Friar Island. Building a large fortification on the tiny island of Friar posed a significant challenge. Several proposals were made, such as the proposal to make many artificial islands, but the most accurate proposal was that of the first lieutenant of the United States Corps of Engineers, John J. Kickman, who proposed to better modify the Friar's Island very aggressively to give it the necessary size and make it more suitable. His proposal was simply to surround the island with a thick wall of concrete and steel to give it an oval shape and then raise it to 12 meters above the tide. Also mount two huge 305mm turrets to cover the entrance and exit of the bay, and it would also be equipped with observation posts. And these observation posts would lead to a bunker that would basically provide the staff with protection and also facilities such as kitchens, bedrooms, weapon rooms, workshops, and living rooms. In the end, Kickman's proposal would not be accepted, but the final plan would largely copy his concept. Construction began in April of 1909 and lasted 5 years, where the rocky island of El Fraile was leveled by the engineers of the United States Army. They raised thick layers of reinforced concrete around it. The final design had two double turrets, this time of 356 millimeters, but pointing to the area outside the bay, the walls gave it an angled shape more in line with the shape of the island, giving it the appearance of a warship. Two lower 6-inch or 150mm batteries were also installed to provide side coverage. This entire complex would provide over 1,000 square meters of space for the 300 men and 20 officers, with bathrooms, bedrooms, kitchens, a hospital, weapon rooms, offices for the officers, and common areas. Fort Drum would be 110 meters long by 44 meters wide and 12 meters high. The walls were between 7.6 to 36 feet thick, making it practically impregnable against any type of naval attack. The turrets were really special. The main ones had a 450mm steel armor and were specifically made for Fort Drum, so no similar turrets were seen in any other fortification in the area. They rotated by electrically moved tracks, and the ammunition was raised from the bottom of the fort by electric elevators. Both cannons operated independently of each other, and these, along with the 150mm side cannons, which were two on each side, one on top of the other, gave the fort a truly formidable firepower for any ship of the time. At the bow, it had a huge 26-meter cage-designed mast for observation, which in its final times would carry radio antennas, spotlights, and rangefinders similar to those of warships. All of this, along with the shape of the island and the cannons, gave Fort Drum its characteristic look of a battleship of the time. In 1914, Fort Drum entered service and was handed over to the 59th Regiment of American Coastal Artillery. The men who operated the fort gave it the nickname of United States Ship No Go. However, from then on, only problems would come for Fort Drum. After the First World War, the United States of America would greatly reduce its military budget, so little by little, the budget to maintain Fort Drum was reduced to unacceptable minimums. During the 1920s, its cannons and machinery started becoming obsolete. The 14 inches caliber cannons were already present in modern battleships, and the machinery, like power plants that use 225 horsepower engines, were practically technologies of the past cycle. A fairly aggressive modernization was planned, but these imperative updates for the fort would not arrive because the United States would sign the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 with the world powers. From that moment on, the United States could not make any investment or improvement in defensive positions in the Pacific. The 30s would also be difficult because with the Great Depression, the U.S. further reduced the military budget for the fort and things would get worse. Even more for the fort in 1934, as the U.S. would sign a treaty that would give independence to the Philippines in 1944, so the U.S. was not going to invest money in a military base that was going to end up in the hands of a foreign country in 10 years. Due to all these problems, Fort Drum became a big white elephant practically abandoned, but by the end of the 30s, the Empire of Japan was becoming a latent concern for the United States. The Philippines were the possible first line of defense against a, at that time, hypothetical war against the Empire of Japan. In the end, Japan attacked in 1941, and the Japanese practically took over the entire island, while the American and Filipino troops retreated to the Bataan Peninsula, as there the Japanese troops were within range of the Fort Drum and Corridor batteries. Fort Drum was immune to any air attack, but not the observation tower, and the Japanese would attack it to make Fort Drum unable to detect targets. For weeks, Fort Drum was attacked from all positions by Japanese artillery of different calibers. Of course, no projectile could penetrate the thick concrete walls. It is said that Fort Drum received over 3,000 projectile hits, leaving huge craters in the concrete and destroying almost all the covered air defenses. Finally, on April 9, 1942, after many casualties, the American troops would withdraw from Bataan because they considered the peninsula indefensible under those conditions. But the forts of Corregidor and Fort Drum would not be evacuated and were urged to continue resisting. Even though Fort Drum had fired against Japanese landing boats, the Corregidor fort was taken by a successful Japanese night landing on May 6th. When Corregidor fell, Fort Drum simply surrendered to the Japanese without resistance. However, Colonel Kirkpatrick, who was in charge of Fort Drum, maintained that they could definitely have resisted for years fighting against the Japanese. They had ammunition, supplies for 6 months. Moreover, the staff of 428 men was unharmed, apart from some injuries. However, they had no water. Jack Cole, who served at Fort Drum during the war, spoke about it in his memoirs. "If we had had water, we could have lasted 3 or 4 years. All the water that came in was brought from Horse Island. Without water, we were already finished. Even though we have water all around us, we can't drink it." The cannons of Fort Drum fired nonstop until the last minute of the surrender. The men destroyed all the material they could and finally rendered the cannons useless by putting sandbags in them and firing them while obstructed. Colonel Kirkpatrick would die in captivity on April 27, 1943, and the aforementioned Jack Cole was released sometime later. In his interviews, Jack Cole estimated that only 28 of the 425 men who served on the Drum Source survived the prisoner camps. The fall of Batam was one of the greatest defeats in United States history, but that would not be the end of the drum's horse. In 1945, the United States would retake Manila in one of the largest and probably most destructive and bloody military operations in history. The city was almost completely destroyed, and more than 100,000 civilians perished as a result. Fort Drum did not fire a single shot as the Americans took Manila, so it was considered abandoned. However, during a reconnaissance operation, they discovered that there were still Japanese in Fort Drum. It would later be known that they were 68 sailors who were surviving crew members of the battleship Musashi, which had been sunk a few months earlier. 2,000-pound bombs were dropped on Fort Drum in an intense air attack. The fort withstood all these bombs without any problem. The main cannons, however, were definitely rendered useless. And then the United States ship Phoenix managed to disable the side batteries by shooting them quite a bit. The Japanese couldn't attack, but they still refused to surrender. Being entrenched, it was very difficult to take the fort in the old-fashioned way. What the Americans did was simply raise men to the deck using a special landing ship to prevent the Japanese from leaving the fort, to give time to other special landing ships that poured a mixture of diesel and gasoline into the ventilation openings. In addition, the men who were on deck placed explosives in strategic areas. While the Americans were placing explosives, some Japanese opened fire from wherever they could, injuring some men who were on the landing ships. In just a few minutes, they poured more than 11,000 liters of a diesel and gasoline mixture. Then they moved away to watch the spectacle and finally detonated everything. The Americans watched with pride as a huge fireball grew, preceded by a large black column of smoke, marking the end of the enigmatic Fort Drum. To this day, Fort Drum still stands. The fire explosion only caused minimal damage to the structure, of course. The deck is naturally full of craters, and the fort walls are still blackened by the fire, and although it is officially forbidden to access Fort Drum, many do so illegally by helicopters and boats. This is the story of Fort Drum. Thanks for watching. See you next time.